Hello, Sketchaday. My name is Heath Vero, and I'm going to show you today a little bit about painting with a palette knife, and then walk you through a sketch that I'm going to do for today's prompt. But to get started, I just want to point out the surfaces you can paint on. There's a lot of them. This is a painting that was done on a canvas, so you can just paint on a traditional canvas. And this one's been varnished. You could paint on wooden panels. Here's a painting of a iris and a bee that I recently did, and this is a panel from Blick that has this reinforcement on the edges. It's pretty nice. You can paint on wooden panels, and then you can paint on something like this. This is an Artist Loft canvas panel, and every surface will respond a little differently, and how you use the paint might differ a little from surface to surface. Another thing that you can use is canvas paper. I've used a couple different companies or brands. This one is by Strathmore, and I've used it all up. So I bought some other stuff from Blick.com. I figured I would try it. And this company, oh, that word, I don't know how to say it. Bienving, something. But anyways, this is canvas paper, and ouch, just sliced my face off. This is pretty big sized, so I usually cut it down. This is 12 by 16. And so when you paint, every surface will respond a little differently, and the type of paint in and of itself has differences from levels of opaqueness and transparency, and so just play around with a lot of different surfaces. But I have some leftover paint that I have from a previous painting, and I was just going to show you just basic moving around paint and what that looks like, and then we'll get started on our painting for today's prompt. So I've got some leftover paint here, you can see, and this is a piece of glass from a fish tank that sits on this shelf, and I just use glass to put my paint on because it's easy to clean up. If you don't have something like this, you can use a paper plate and just put some out on the paper plate. Before we go any further, I'm just going to mention that palette knives are sharp, and always have an adult present. You don't want to cut yourself with one of these. I like to use the metal ones. There are plastic ones available too, and you can see there's lots of shapes available. There's even hundreds more besides these, but to be honest, I find that I use this one for almost all of the things that I do. These other ones do offer some interesting blends from time to time, and you'll notice that there's a lot of ways to use every brush, like every palette knife, just like with a brush. You can use the edge for lines, the belly to get kind of a nice blend. You can use the tip to be a little bit more surgical and precise. And just like if you have a filbert brush, a round, a flat, a fan brush, like they all offer something specific. And a dagger brush, you can get real interesting lines in the paint. The same thing is true for each of these. So I'm just going to show you right now with that extra paint on this scrap piece of canvas paper what basically happens. So this paint is a little bit tough, and this paper in general, it just absorbs the paint, so it dries a little faster, and it will respond a little differently on any surface you paint. But basically, I just take the knife and you pull it across the paint, and you get some beaded up like this, and you can put that down here and just pull it across, and you get to see variations in the marks. If you have just one pure color, it'll obviously be that color, but I typically use a range of colors. I don't like to just use one color. I mean, if you've seen any of my artwork, I like a range of colors to pull from. If you want to put a little white down on top of it and then just work it in a little and tint it out and see some of the nice bleeds you can get. And if you experiment with the different knives, I'm going to clean off my palette knife. This is a real key thing here, is just to keep your palette knife clean. In fact, I'll just leave this here to show you what I usually do. I just leave it here and I pull it across. But when you want to do a nice blend, this is a really good exercise. Just blending from one color to another. And so I'll show you a couple of the other knives. You can load some up on the edge here. This has a rounded profile that comes in real handy with like tall blades of grass. And anytime you do this, especially with leftover paint, just pay attention to the kinds of marks that each one makes and remember those when you're trying to achieve a certain look in a painting. And you can think back to a time when you created, something that was perfect for the situation you're in. And the more of those that you collect, the bigger your vocabulary becomes of ideas. Some of this paint is kind of dried up. And try different things with geometric solids even. You can use the edge to create nice boxes. Practice just putting down some nice shapes. Maybe outline it. Give it a little highlight, and then I don't know if you want to play with some shades. I'll darken up a little red with the complement green for just a little shadowy value. I mean, I'm not painting anything, but just for practice. So that's a few of the knives. This knife has a nice profile, and the tip is really pointed and sharp. It's like when you want maybe a tip profile, you can use that. And I'm noticing here that you can see the canvas paper has a texture and a life to it, and so when you put paint down, you can go back over it a second and a third time, and you can put down more layers to cover up those spots where the canvas is coming through. And again, how translucent and how opaque is your paint versus, that's a big factor in this. And you'll learn how different colors are going to respond. I'm using oil paint, and you want to have a ventilated area to use oil paint, mainly for the mediums if you use mediums. What I usually do is paint alla prima, which is a wet and wet kind of a technique, so I'll just paint and then continue to paint just one picture, and then it's done in a single effort versus going back multiple times. The larger paintings, I'll go back as many times as I need to finish the surface. And if you're going to put layers on top of layers, you want to use a medium to adhere to the fat over lean principle. And this is the medium that I usually use. It's a Galkid oil painting medium. It does dry the paint up a little faster, so all this does, or any other kind of medium, all it does is it changes the properties of the paint a little bit, making it more workable or more stiff, or making it last, be wet longer, dry faster. It'll create all kinds of textures. But this has kind of a smell, and you want to have a ventilated area. Oil paint itself, it has a smell, but it's not oil like your car uses oil. It's linseed oil, more of a plant. So I wanted to mention that. So there's a few cautions if you do this. You want to make sure that you're careful of this pointed edges here, and you want to be careful to have good ventilation. And I'll show you, I have a little bit more paint here just to show you here. This knife has a profile kind of rounded, and anytime you go back and forth like this, you're kind of dropping a little paint, and then you're picking some paint up. You see that? And so this is an interesting way to blend, and if you have an area and you want to put different colors down to kind of introduce kind of a blended, choppy look, you can use this kind of a technique. So if I want to use some red and put red over here, I can work this knife over here, and then if I go over here and put this down, I'm going to have some red on the knife still. So if you don't want that to happen, you want to clean off your knife. Pick up some other paint. Let's see, what else do I have? I have a real mess of colors that I was working with. Let's do some stuff here with some green. So just slightly moving it across, and I'm just subtly changing the angle. If you're like this and pull it across, you're going to be applying some paint, but if you push too hard, you're scraping it up. See how I'm pushing pretty hard? That's scraping it up, and it's building up a bead of paint on the belly of the knife. So I can flatten the blade out and gently pull it across, and that leaves the paint there. So this is, again, canvas paper, and it will respond a little differently than, say, a wooden board will. If you use a wooden board, you can just use some gesso on it to prepare the surface to receive paint. This rounded knife, it obviously has a round profile, so if you're painting something round and you want to get to the edge of it, you can make kind of a nice circle. And then in terms of blending, if you take, what I've found that I like this knife for is like hair or other kind of wavy things, because if you put some paint on the edge of the knife like this, and then you just pull it across in a circular fashion, you can create some interesting kind of textural blends. And now this paint is a little bit dry for that, but you can put paint down, and then you can see if I tint it out a little bit, I can get some nice effects like that. And then if you leave it flat and pull the blade across, it's going to be a little bit wider of an area. And then if you work it in, you can see the effect that you get. Okay. So here's a larger knife. And the larger the knife, the little bit more flexibility you have at the tip, which is something to keep in mind, because if you're trying to be covering a big area and you have paint loaded up everywhere, you have to just be prepared that it may not put paint all the way towards the tip. See how the tip isn't actually putting much paint down? What's getting a lot of paint is this area, because that's where a lot of the strength of this knife is. Okay, and being that this is canvas paper and this paint is older and it's drying a little faster, if you go back over it a second time, you know, this may be dry a little bit, so you kind of you expect that and then use that information to work forward. And you can see how some of this paint is dry and it's actually bunching up. So that's kind of how you use a palette knife. And I'm not painting in an alla prima fashion, impasto fashion, where it's really thick globular layers of paint. I don't particularly like that kind of painting. If you do, more power to you. I think it looks amazing. I just don't like to do it. If that makes any sense. So what I do is a little bit more thin in layers, you know, and the layer of paint that you see here, I'll pick it up so you can see it. It's really not very much paint on there at all. It's covering and it's filling in all the paper, and obviously it's going to have a nice textural feel on the end when it's all dry, but it isn't the same thing as impasto, where you take a big glob of paint, you know, and you just leave it there. You know, if you wanted to, you know, really load up the paint on the knife and then just kind of glob it in there. You know, that uses a lot more paint out of the tube, and oil paint is, it varies in prices, but I mean, like a tube this size is anywhere from $8 to $30 depending on the color, you know. But there's lots of neat flower paintings where they leave it real impasto like this. And you can see the difference between that and that. And this might really appeal to you. And if you put some white on the knife and tint it out a little bit, you can get some interesting fades in the colors. I mean, it's real pretty. Just, it's not really what I like to do. So anyways, there's some basic uses of a palette knife and how you can approach each surface, just knowing that the paint's going to differ in how opaque it is. The knife is going to give you so many different options, and the surface itself is going to give you a lot of options when you start to move paint around. So with all of that, I'm going to go ahead and get ready. I'll clean up my mess here, and then we'll start on our painting for today. Here's a little closer look at what we just did, and you can see the different bleeds that we got and the different blending marks we left. And then over here with the impasto, if I tilt this up, you can see that there's sort of some mountains of paint. That'll take a lot longer to dry if you're using oil paint than this will. See how it's really kind of thin? But anyways, that's what it looks like up close. So this is that piece of glass from the fish tank, and you can use a paper plate, but if you take the cap off your tube of paint, I put down about this much paint to start with, and then if I need more, I'll put more out. But I don't like to waste paint because it's kind of expensive, and you can just put more down if you want. And then as you paint more pictures with palette knives, you'll start to see how much you use, and then you can adjust from there. So here are the colors that I'm going to use. I'll say right away that it's unnecessary to have all these colors to create a nice painting. I like to create paintings with a range of blues and a range of browns. I'm going to use blue and brown, but when you mix colors, I just wanted to show you this step and how much paint I used. I'm using a little more titanium white. I feel like I use white quite a bit. So if I wanted to mix up some blue, for example, I use a little Prussian blue, and I'll mix up some of that with this cadmium red light. The reason I'm using this is to get kind of an interesting brown. I'll just scrape a little bit from the pile and then mix it here in this front area. You can see I'm getting kind of a nice brown there. You know, but it's a range. See the nice range of colors that you get? That's how I approach mixing colors. So I've got kind of the pile still available, and then I've got my mix area here in front. And then I'm going to clean off my palette knife, you know, and then just mix up some blues. So here you can see the mixes that I'm going to start with, and here's the color palette that I kind of want to use. Now this is just a starting point, you know, and as the painting develops and you start to see what maybe the painting is wanting, it seems weird to say that, but you kind of make adjustments from there. But this is a starting point that I wanted to use for this painting. So this is the mix, and you can see I still have plenty of paint to pull from to continue making certain blends as I need. And from there, just keep the palette knife clean, and then we'll start painting our picture. So here's a reference photo that I used from Pixabay.com, and I'm using that mainly to pull ideas from, not to be pushed around by, just as a reference. And you can see that I moved some things around. I started off with a basic value sketch, and you can see I'm using the golden ratio to place key features in the painting. And the golden ratio is an interesting thing if you want to research it on the internet, how artists have used that throughout centuries past. And it's just a way to, on the composition side, to place things that are interesting on those lines, and it balances out your artwork in an interesting way. I started with Vine charcoal, and I drew everything in, and then I used white and black charcoal sticks to balance out highlights and shadows, just to see if it would look okay and what I might want to adjust, solving problems before I even use paint. You know, that's what the main reason is for doing this stage of it. I feel like my paintings are always better if I do this instead of just jumping right into a painting. I then reproduce that basic sketch, even real basic. I don't put very many details because I know that it's going to be painted over, and all those details that I labored over don't really actually help me. So I just reproduce the lines with the golden ratio, and then from there use those as a place to anchor those key features. So using my color palette, I like to start with the background. So in this case, it's the sky, and I use different blends of blue and white to achieve some interesting blends. And then underneath that, I'm going to put the mountains, and on the left-hand side of the mountains, I'm going to put a little bit lighter values, and on the right-hand side will be some darker values. And these are in the distance, so there's a lot of blue that travels from a great length like that. And then underneath the mountains, there are some trees in the distance, and I focus a little bit more browns and reds in there. And this is a nice wintry scene, so not any leaves really on too many trees, maybe some dead orange ones you can see from a distance. But I don't put every detail in there. I just kind of hint at some details and let the viewer's mind do the rest. As it transitions down into the field, you can see that I've put some subtle blends of white and blue, and I start working into some shades. Now there's little patches of snow and areas where the grass is poking through the snow. And then from there, I move into the cabin. I start on the lighter tones where the side receives most of the sunlight. And then I use some darker tones, some more of the brown, dark browns for the shaded side. I decided that what was at first going to be a door, I wanted it to be a window. It just seemed like it would be a nice included feature that would reflect something from something where I was standing, looking down on the scene. It would add a little bit of interest. And then all throughout, I worked in some some darker blue tones for shadows that were cast shadows from the barn or that little shed and the tree. You'll see that there's some dead grass that's noticeable in the foreground there, and all together I'm just working in, revisiting little areas for highlights and areas where I can push the dark tones, and from there you're gonna walk away from it, come back to it, revisit it with fresh eyes to see what changes you want to make, and then don't forget to sign your masterpiece and share it with your friends. But yep, that about sums it up. So I hope you found that useful and inspiring to create your own palette knife painting. Give it a try.